You're tuned in to Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick. This is episode 135, The Original Church, with Dr. Jim Papandrea. Before we jump into tonight's episode, guys, just a word about my sponsor, Havana Palace, on here on Church Road in Windsor, Ontario. For the best service and finest cigars, go see Caesar and Eli. They treat all their customers like family. If you would be so kind as to go to facebook.com/Havana Palace, give their page a like, I would greatly appreciate that. I'm back with my returning guest and dear friend, Jim. How are you doing this evening, sir?
Well, good. It's great to be back. How you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. You know
Yeah,
what? I
great.
almost never drink wine, but because you're here, right, I thought I'd switch it up a little bit. This is
All right.
bread and butter Merlot. I have no idea where it came from. I
Oh,
just happened to have a bottle in the house, so
hey, then that's then that's what works. I've got I'm drinking a Negro Amaro, which is one of the varietals from Puglia, Italy. So Puglia, like Italy, shaped like a boot. Puglia is the heel of the boot. So we're in the heel of the boot with some Negro Amaro.
very nice, very nice. Well, as far as feast days go, today's the Transitus of St. Francis, I believe, and tomorrow's his actual feast day, right? So,
Right, right.
Seraphic Father, pray for us as we get into tonight's episode, which is going to be great as always. You know, it's funny when I do these with you, Jim. I don't even feel like I'm doing like a show per se. It just feels like, hey, I'm getting on the horn to talk to my good friend, talk to him about what matters most. That is our Lord and His wonderful church, and
Yeah.
have some libations while we're doing it. It doesn't just feels like conversation. I love it. Love it.
Yeah,
Love
I
it.
know. I feel the same way. I don't get nervous about these, although that also means I don't prepare that much for for your show. But,
Don't feel bad.
we're keeping it casual. So
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Well, we're here tonight to talk about your new book, The Original Church, and the
hmm
subtitle is What It Meant and Still Means to Be a Christian, right? And this
Yep.
is Scepter Publishing. This just came out how long ago?
Not even a month ago officially. It was out for pre-order in August and came out sometime in September officially.
And I already got my
And
copy. Awesome.
yeah. Well, this is my first book with Scepter, and I love these guys. They're now in my top, maybe couple of favorite publishers to work with. They actually came to me and said,
Hmm.
"Hey, would you write a book that kind of summarizes and presents a culmination of everything you've been doing on the YouTube channel, The Original Church?" And I was very happy to be able to do that. And so that's kind of what the book is. Yeah.
So they approached you based off of the cool series that you have on your channel called The Original Church by the same name. And I love the length of your videos. They're perfect. They definitely grab your attention.
Well, they
Christianity.
they they liked the length of this book too. They gave me a limit. They said they didn't want it to be any longer than this because some of my books are longer. So
Yeah, this is a nice bite-size appetizer, but it's by no means lacking in any department. It's perfectly balanced. It's perfect for the palate. It's got whatever you need. It's got a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And I know because I've not read the whole thing admittedly yet. I haven't had time, but I have read as much as I could so far. And what I'm reading, I absolutely love it. I actually had a chance to read some in the church the other day when I went to confession while I was waiting for Father to come out. And I got to read about the original church when I was sitting inside the original church, doing what the original church did, i.e., go to confession. So
yeah,
that was
yeah,
awesome. What an experience. Well, Jim, this book's unique because you would think by just looking at the title, you're just going to tell us a little bit about, the original church, its practices, maybe about the liturgy, about intercession of saints, etc., and so on, and kind of like a survey of this is what the early church believed. But you took it a little bit of in a different direction. You wanted to show us what the original church was like through the eyes of the ordinary layperson, right? That's what I think makes this
yeah.
unique
That's
because
right.
I haven't seen that angle taken in any books on the early church before. So that's kind of cool. How did you come up with that angle?
Well, it was kind of part of the conversation with Scepter with the publisher because it's their charism to to really be interested in the formation of the laity. And since we're lay people, I wanted to write something, and I always want to write for people like us, for the laity. And so, yeah, a lot of my books are about the big controversies and the heresies and the clarification of doctrine and the famous bishops who wrote important documents and all that. Look, yeah, it's different. It's how did the average layperson see themselves and their identity as a member of the body of Christ in the early church? And it's a little harder to do that, right? Because the average person didn't write down what they thought or how they saw themselves. So I had to
Hmm.
kind of come at it from the angle of the apologists, and using a lot of these statements that the apologists make about how Christians are different from the culture around them. You guys do this, but we do this, and in doing this, it contributes to our self definition of who we are, our very identity as Christians.
Hmm. Hmm. What I like too is um, you kind of you bust a lot of myths, but one of the ones right off the bat is this idea that the church simply modeled itself on Roman society. I mean, there's an element of that. What I kind of see um, in your book, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but you know how Philo of Alexandria combined Jewish tradition through a Greek philosophical lens. And in
Yeah.
a way, you could say that the early Christians were like that. They didn't divorce
Mhm.
themselves from their Jewish background, but they kind of um, placed it in to the Roman world, and it was like a beautiful tapestry. Because you do say early on that the church that Jesus left us and what he established was something that was coming out of the temple, and what came after that with the destruction of the temple was like post-temple rabbinic Judaism, and that went another direction. But what the early Christians inherited was the temple tradition, but they also had an interesting context because they were also dealing with Roman society, and that was the culture in which they lived. So, like, what are some ways that the early church kind of walked that line between having that background in temple tradition, that Jewish tradition, but also saw itself as part of Roman society? That's really interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Christians and their relationship with the non-Christian Jews, well, that was kind of the first conflict they had. And we read in the book of Acts that there's a certain amount of persecution by Jews against Christians who were almost all still Jews at that point.
Hmm.
Um, but in spite of that, I mean, the Christian worldview and theology is all like solidly grounded on Hebrew faith, right? It's just that the Christians saw themselves as having been given, or everyone was offered, but the Christians were those who accepted the fulfillment of Hebrew faith. But it's really with the Romans and in conflict with Roman culture that Christianity it kind of is outed, if you will, as countercultural, because most people are familiar with some of this stuff. The under Roman law, a man could kill his children, especially if a child was born and he wasn't 100% sure it was his. They drown it in a bucket or they expose it on the garbage pile. And so one of the very first things we ever get outside of the New Testament is in the Didache, where the whole "we don't do this"
Hmm.
is something that defines who we are, and we don't expose our children, and we don't have the same view of marriage and what adultery is and isn't. We don't have the same view as you Romans, and so these are the kinds of things that when you put it all together, you really get a picture of the self understanding, the self awareness of what a Christian is,
Hmm.
of the early Christians.
Yeah. Um, in what ways? So, how did the Christians see when you're talking about the hierarchy of the church? It wasn't modeled off of like the Roman military or anything like that, but it was modeled off of like the familial network of
Yeah.
relationships in some sense, right? So how did Christians, well, first of all, if we could explain like what that is, how does that look, what did that look like? I mean, the Roman family system, the patron client relationship, the
Hmm.
father of the immediate family, then the grandfather, you know, you put all these
Yeah.
elements in there. So how did that work, and how did Christians see themselves as operating within that context?
Yeah. Well, you have to understand that in Roman culture, the extended family is everything. And so even even let's say I get married, I move out of my father's house, I live in a separate household with a wife and a family of my own. I am never really out from under my father as long as he's alive. And so, you've got these sort of two layers of the family that are never disconnected. The immediate household and then the extended family, the extended household, and the father over the extended household is called the pater familias, the family father, right? Well, that is one way in which I think the church kind of mirrors that, because what you have in the church as the church develops is you have an individual house church, or what we today would call a parish,
Hmm.
um, under its father. And it's not a coincidence that priests are called father. That is exactly why we call our priests father. And we can even see it in the New Testament, where St. Paul refers to himself as the father of these other people that he's either converted or he's discipling. And so but then in the city or in a region, you have a bishop who's in authority over the individual house churches. And so the bishop functions as the pater familias of that city or that region, which, you might call him a bishop, you might call him a patriarch, but
Hmm.
patriarch just means family father. It's kind of the same word. And so in that way, the development of the church mirrors a little bit Roman society, but not in the sense that people usually think. My students sometimes expect me to say that the hierarchy of the church developed so that, you know, powerful, rich white men could, you know,
Yeah.
keep their grasp on their power and wealth. Well, no, nobody had wealth or power back then, very few. And to be a bishop had nothing to do with wealth or power. But it did have something to do with these family relationships, and then of course it had everything to do with the sort of discipleship or apprenticeship model that Jesus started with his disciples,
Hmm.
so that in any given setting, the theoretically the priests of the individual house churches are the disciples or the apprentices of the bishop in that city, and so on, at least until the church gets too big for that to be sort of literally true. But that's the idea.
So would you say in Rome, like that based off of that dynamic, it seems to me that like one bishop per city would be very fitting, because
Hmm.
he's the father, the extended father, and then you have the immediate fathers over their house churches, right? So that makes sense in that way too.
It does. And for a while there was a scholar who's an otherwise great scholar, but he'd proposed this idea that the so-called monoepiscopacy, the one bishop per city, was perhaps a later development. And in my early days, I'm embarrassed to admit, but in my early days, I sort of bought into that.
Uh-huh.
And yet then when you actually read the sources and you think it through logically, and you take into account things like apostolic succession, the way, obviously, the apostles are the first bishops, so they would have appointed their own successors. And so, when you put all that together, you realize, nah, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that a single bishop per city would have been a later development. It had to
Hmm.
have been there from the beginning. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't controversies over this. And Clement's letter, First Clement of Rome's letter to the Corinthians, may have something to do with some sort of controversy over this kind of thing. We're not entirely sure. And Ignatius of Antioch, writing in about, between 107 and 110, in one of his letters, he writes, well, don't you know that there should only be one bishop per city? So, he's saying it in a way that maybe somebody doesn't know that. Maybe somebody's arguing against it. So, you know, it's not necessarily that there was never any controversy or any
Mm.
question over this, but it seems much more logical and much more consistent with the evidence that the idea of one bishop per city was the ideal from the beginning.
Right, and when the church fathers speak of things like this, they're not writing to, because Christians were against innovation because they received what has been handed down. To quote one
Yeah.
of the titles of your books, they're handed down, right? So I see
Yeah,
how I
yeah.
did
I
that.
wish I had made that up, but I think I stole it from St. Paul. But anyway,
So yeah,
yeah,
they receive what was handed down, and so they're very weary of innovation, obviously.
right.
So when Ignatius is writing that, this is the ideal, he's not making something up on the spot. He's saying, like, this is what has been handed down, and this is the ideal. Now, whether that was always being practiced is another matter, but this was the
Yeah,
tradition that had been received.
yeah, yeah. And I tend to think this is what I think about the situation behind First Clement, and I could be wrong about this, but I think that what's going on in Corinth is that um, either either the bishop had died and there was a dispute over who was going to be the next bishop, or it could be because there's this question of the young versus the old. It could be that someone was questioning whether the office of bishop should be for life, right?
Hmm.
And again, I think the original ideal would have been, kind of obviously, once you're a bishop for life. You can't be unordained. And
Hmm.
so, but it seems like maybe there was somebody in Corinth saying, "Hey, give somebody else a chance to be the bishop here. This guy's living too long, or whatever." And
Yeah.
and Clement of Rome has to step in and say, I'm sending a delegation to sort this out, which unfortunately I wish he'd give us more information, but I think that's what's going on. So yeah, you can see how they sort of navigate their way through this stuff. Um, but but yeah, it's very interesting. And you mentioned the patron client system.
Hmm.
We have some elements of that influence the church as well. And for those who might not know, the patron client system is a network of relationships within society where people who are of less means or less power have a patron who has more wealth and more power to kind of protect them, but they have to reciprocate by then you know voting the way the patron wants them to vote, and doing the patron's dirty work, or showing up to cheer for the patron's lawyer whenever he's in court, etc. So the way we see that playing out in the church is those few wealthy people who joined the church in the early decades and stuff. Well, they become the patrons of the church in the sense that often they're the ones who offer up their homes for the church to meet in, right? But the misconception about this, so like when you read in the New Testament that Lydia has a house church,
Hmm.
and I may be paraphrasing this badly, but greet those who meet in the house of Lydia, or the house of Priscilla and Aquila, or whatever, right? When you read that what that's telling you is this person is the patron of that house church, that parish. So Lydia presumably is a wealthy woman,
Hmm.
businesswoman, who has a home big enough for the congregation to meet in. But that does not mean that Lydia is the presider over the sacraments. And this is what people get wrong, because you can find books that will tell you, well, there were women pastors or priests in the early church. There were not. There is no evidence that women ever presided over the sacraments in the early church. So you have to keep in mind that the hierarchy of clergy is completely separate from this patron client thing,
Hmm.
although the patron client thing uh, you know does enter into it in the sense that the church itself can have patrons, and these wealthy people are protecting the church, giving space for the church to meet, and then eventually donating the land for the catacombs and all of that.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned women presiding over the sacraments. And I don't know if you heard the news, but a woman was just appointed Archbishop of Canterbury.
I did hear that. So
Yeah,
the
so
so in that in that role, in a certain way, she is the successor of Saint Anselm of Canterbury.
yeah, that's the
And who else?
idea.
Who else was Bishop of Canterbury? Big a couple of big church fathers or uh,
Saint
Sc-
Saint Augustine, a different Augustine of Canterbury.
the other Augustine. But I'm
Yeah,
thinking of somebody like um, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah, so I did hear that, but only that. That's as much as I know. I throughout my career have gone to the patristic conferences in Oxford, and so I've had the chance to hear one or more archbishops of Canterbury speak, and they they swing in a pendulum from like sounding very Catholic to not sounding Catholic. So I have no idea. I don't know this particular person. So yeah.
yeah. I just thought that was, you know, pertinent to bring up given what we're talking about right now with women. And speaking of women, like we know how women were viewed in Roman society. So how much of a revolution did the early church bring when it came to like the role and perception of women? How would a woman have seen herself as a member of the laity?
Well, I think a woman would have seen the church as, well, to use a contemporary phrase, like extremely liberating. Like the church
Hmm.
was way ahead of its time in women's rights and in the protection of women. So, I mean, we could do a whole show about this, but the fact that from the as early as we can tell, there is a place for what's called the consecrated virgin. Now, in the early decades of the church, it's not like they have a convent to live in. So they
Hmm.
probably lived at home, but in more or less seclusion, and they chose a life of prayer. But at least this vocation, well, I shouldn't even use air quotes. It really is a vocation. I could put air quotes around the word order. It's kind of an order of religious, um, but it's a true vocation. And this vocation gave women an option if they did not feel called to the vocation of marriage and childbearing. This gave them another vocation. That's kind of radical because, unless you're, one of the six girls that gets picked to be a Vestal Virgin, and that's not necessarily a good thing, that this option isn't open to women. In other ways, the church was protective of women. Um, Obviously making divorce less easy, but because sometimes a woman who's left can be in danger of destitution, but also just in terms of the way women were treated in the society. The thing about head coverings,
Hmm.
it's it's not it's not about hats, right? Head coverings, in when Paul says women should cover their heads, he's talking about veils. He's talking about wearing a veil so that you know you're treated more respectfully on the street. It's a modesty thing. It's so that you don't get groped or worse, and you don't get mistaken for a prostitute or whatever. So that's another form of protection for women. Now, on the other hand, the thing about women keeping quiet and not teaching men,
Yeah.
well, that was a kind of a concession to the culture, right? So it's very interesting. Like, and I'm thinking of Paul in particular, but it's interesting that sometimes Paul has no problem being countercultural, and other times Paul has a sort of prudence or discernment where he says, "Okay, well, we're not going to rock the boat on this issue,"
Hmm. Hmm.
and so like the Ephesians 5 thing, it's for a lot of people, it's their favorite passage to hate in the Bible because it says, "Women, be submissive to your husbands." But the fact that it says, "Husbands, love your wives," that's a radical idea in Roman culture, because marriage in Roman culture, especially among the upper classes, is a business contract. It's a transaction. a dowry changes hands and two families merge like two corporations, and you get married again, especially for the wealthy. You get married for reasons of social climbing and consolidation of wealth, and then you go find love elsewhere
Mm-hmm.
outside the marriage. That's,
Mm-hmm.
um, but here's Paul saying, no, no, no. Love is the basis for this covenant of matrimony, right? So in many ways, the church was was very much ahead of its time, and even by our standards, and was interested in protecting women and children as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I wouldn't when I read Ephesians 5 and I see St. Paul saying, husbands, love your wives, that's just something that 90% of us would just gloss over. Like that's a given. But as you said, it's countercultural in Roman society. I didn't even think to put two and two together. So
Right, right.
that in itself is revolutionary.
It's the opposite of what we think when we read it. We would read that and say, wives, submit to your husbands, husbands, love your wives. It looks to us like he's asking a lot more of the women
Mm-hmm.
than of the men. But it's really the opposite. In Roman culture, it would look to the reader there like he's asking a lot more of the men, and he's only asking the women to do what they would always do otherwise. But I think there's an even greater sort of spiritual genius behind that, which is that, and I'm going to probably get in trouble for saying this, but men and women are not the same, uh, and we need different things, even in a marriage relationship. And so men need to be sort of respected, and women need to be loved in perhaps a more emotional way. So I think there's something in there, and I'm not a psychologist, so I'll say this and then I'll stop because I'll be at the limit of knowing what I'm talking about. But I think there's something in there where Paul recognizes through inspiration that that men and women need different things, and he's trying to get them to give each other what they need. It's almost like he's figured out the five love languages in advance. Like,
Yeah.
don't assume that what looks like love to you is going to also look like love to your partner, but love them in the way they need to be loved. And so I think that's what he's getting at there. I think it's actually maybe one of the most underrated passages in the New Testament, in the sense that people do skip over it and don't really appreciate it. But yeah.
Yeah, that's why it's so important to know the background world and context of scripture instead of just reading the words on the page, which, it's hard for us to dive deep. I mean, society is so fast paced. We're so distracted. We don't really have time to sit down and, and mull over this kind of stuff. But it's thankfully we have people like you to do it. And so you could do all the hard work, all the heavy lifting, and then we could just reap the benefits. So I like
Yeah.
that.
Well, I appreciate that you say that. I mean, I've always said that in order to really understand the New Testament, you have to understand the Roman Empire and the cultural context. And unfortunately, there are way too many New Testament scholars out there who don't, and who just treat the New Testament as a book that you can study on its own, like, To Kill a Mockingbird or something. I mean, well, even that you need to know the context, right?
Yeah, right.
I don't know. I can't think of a book that you don't need to know the context to study, but it's. I think there's way too many New Testament scholars who have this sort of tunnel vision, and they look at only the words in the text, and or at least the stuff they write makes it seem like that's all they're looking at. And so anyway, I could go on and on about my pet peeves about New Testament scholarship, but I think you really do need both together. You need, the history of the early church in the Roman Empire, and the New Testament.
Yeah. And perhaps, and this is what you talk about in the book, perhaps a lot of the background assumptions that come into reading the words on the page and sort of taking them at face value actually comes from a Protestant ethos, and sort of
Yeah.
taking that for granted as the baseline or the default. I think that's part of it too. And you do bring that up. You say, I'm not intending for this to be an apologetics work, but nevertheless, apologetics to some degree has to be done. But of course,
Yeah.
it's responsible apologetics, right? So, talk to me about that. You didn't want to make this an apologetics work, but yet you still had to deal with some pretty big issues and clear some stuff out of the
Yeah.
way.
There's no avoiding it. And, the bottom line is I don't consider myself an apologist. There are better people than me out there doing apologetics. The world of apologetics doesn't need me. Well, although sometimes I see videos on YouTube of some of these apologists, like the Catholic Answers guys and stuff, and I love all of them. They're all awesome. But sometimes I see them talking about something, and I know immediately from the title of the video which book of mine they just read.
Yeah, yeah,
So
true.
there's that. But anyway, that's fine. I'm happy to be the support. But I don't consider myself an apologist, and so I wasn't trying to do apologetics. But you can't avoid it. I still have arguments, on email and stuff with Protestants who just think that infant baptism is a later development, and that they weren't doing infant baptism in the early church. And that is, of course, we're not going to have that argument now. We've had that discussion before, but I mean,
Hmm.
to see it as though adult only baptism is the original form of baptism is just to betray the fact that you haven't really read the sources, and you haven't really studied the issues, and you're just kind of an armchair, you know, uh, theologian.
Yeah.
So I mean,
Well,
it's you just keep bumping up against these things that Protestants get so completely wrong.
yeah, and we do love our Protestant brothers and sisters, so it's not a slugfest,
We
but
do. I mean, I teach at a Protestant seminary. Everybody
right,
knows that,
right,
and I've been as ecumenical as I can possibly be throughout my whole career. But the more I do this work, the more I can't. I mean, you just can't be quiet about it. It's just, uh, you know, um, the idea, for example, sola fide, faith alone, that whole doctrine, it's debunked immediately when you look at just a couple of things that Jesus actually said and that the early church took seriously, like John 6. You know, the reception of the Eucharist is a requirement for salvation. If you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, you won't have life. And I'm paraphrasing that, but you know what I'm talking about. Um, if you don't forgive others, your Father in heaven won't forgive you. These are works that you have to do to be saved. Simple as that. And I mean, obviously Matthew 25 and that whole thing. So
yeah,
so the way you know people talk about faith alone today, and once saved always saved and this stuff. I mean, I just keep having to say no. Those things are inventions of the Protestant Reformation, and and so don't start telling me that my icons came later or whatever, when when your adult only baptism and your sola fide came way 1,000 years later than that, or whatever. So
yeah. And you know what I was thinking too when it comes to infant baptism. So if you read the words of the New Testament, you could come away with the notion that, well, the baptism of children isn't specifically mentioned. Like we baptize our children. You can make deductions. There's allusions to it, obviously, but again, it goes back to understanding Roman society, and that's actually a key element here, because we
yeah,
talk about the Christians understanding themselves as being adopted into a family with that family structure. So it's not an individualistic endeavor. When one person is baptized, we're talking about the conversion and the extension of grace, the offer of grace to an entire family. It wasn't isolated individuals
right,
having this
right,
conversion experience like we so often hear about. Not that those things are bad, but that wasn't the crux of it. That wasn't the crux of conversion, having an individualistic separated kind of emotional experience, although that can be part of it, but it was primarily households, families.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And we see family baptisms in the New Testament. And I always, point out, when St. Peter preaches that first post Pentecost sermon, and the people say, well, what do we need to do to be saved? And he says, well, you need to get baptized, because he says this is the promise for you and your children. And I know that people are tempted to maybe interpret that away as though he's saying you and your descendants.
Right.
But this is Peter on the day of Pentecost. This is one of those guys who thought Jesus was coming back in their lifetime at this point, right? And so he's not thinking about descendants. He's looking at the crowd of people, full of people of all ages, and he's saying, you and your children, those kids right there. And Jesus is probably going to come back within our lifetimes. That's what he's thinking. So, and then of course, the evidence from the early church itself is that the only real argument over infant baptism was whether or not to wait 8 days like circumcision. So clearly they were doing it. If they were arguing about whether should they do it, right away as soon as the baby's born, or wait 8 days,
Yeah.
So
that's not for nothing. Why would they say that
yeah.
otherwise, right?
Yeah. So I mean, it's just one of those issues that it's a settled issue, and yet it just keeps coming back around because people, refuse to see the truth. And what was it, Clement of Alexandria, who said, just because your eyes are closed and you can't see the sun doesn't mean the sun isn't shining.
Yeah, nice. Yeah.
I know I sound like an apologist tonight. I'm
you
on
really
a roll
do.
here. Must be the wine.
Must be the wine, yeah. I'm not so much on a roll, but that's because I'm the student and you're the teacher, and I'm soaking it up. So I love this. There's times when I like to talk, and there's times, and that's just not an excuse for me not have to do anything. But there's times when I like to just sit back and just soak it all in, and not be the center of attention. Not that I like to be the center of attention, and I know you don't either. You're a very humble guy, but it's nice to be able to relax and just feel like I'm in class, because I haven't felt that way since 2010. So it's been a while since I have been in academia or anything close to it. So it's a nice feeling. So yeah, how would a Christian have seen themselves as, okay, they commit a mortal sin. They're contrite for their sins, obviously they're sorry, but what do they do next? Like, what's on their mind? Okay, I've committed a mortal sin. I know what mortal sins are. I know there's sins that are leading to death, and those that are not leading to death. It's right there in the New Testament, right? There's a distinction between types of sins. So a Christian commits a mortal sin. What's on their mind now? What should they do?
Yeah, and let me just preface this by saying, here's another myth that I was actually taught when I came up in the Protestant world. I was taught that all sin is equal in the eyes of God. And, that comes from the Protestants getting rid of the sacrament of confession. It's a justification for that. So what would they do in the early church? Well, in the earliest centuries, I think it's pretty clear that a mortal sin is anything that breaks one of the 10 commandments. Eventually, you start to get these lists of the worst sins you can commit, which are, murder, adultery, idolatry, heresy, right? But in the earliest decades and first couple centuries of the church, it's not entirely clear what the practice was, and I suspect that there was a diversity of practice across the empire. If there was a consensus, somebody might have written it down, but most likely what's going on there is that the churches, the congregations are so small that there's hardly ever anything like a private sin. If you've committed a mortal sin, everybody in your church knows it. So there doesn't seem to be a need for the privacy of the confessional, right? So it seems, and then when we have the controversies in the aftermath of the persecutions, where people have committed idolatry and denied the faith to save their lives or their livelihoods, and now they want to come back to receive communion, And well, you can't, right? So you're going to have to do something first. And it seems like at that point, they're standing up in front of the congregation and confessing publicly, because again, everyone knows what you did. And then they are reconciled by the bishop with the laying on of hands. It's almost, they don't rebaptize, but
Hmm.
it's almost like they reconfirm. Not really, but almost like that.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah. Um, but it's with the controversy over who can hear confessions that we start to get the idea of, or at least we start to see in the documents, the idea of private confession that is almost a form of spiritual direction, right?
Right.
And of course, the answer to the question is that only clergy uh, can um, can hear confessions, because only clergy have the authority handed down from Jesus to the apostles to bind and loose, to forgive sin.
To forgive sins. So
Um,
that's what binding and loosing
yeah,
means, right? That's the
right, right.
context. Yeah.
And of course, that authority is for the bishops, but they can delegate it to the priests. So it's probably, somewhere, well, it's in the 3rd century, I think, that we start to see evidence of, it might have been happening earlier,
Hmm.
but we start to see the evidence of private confession to the priest or bishop. Um, and I'm not 100%, I'm not an expert on Eastern Orthodox sacraments. So I think that it developed slightly differently in the East, but basically that's kind of the development of it. But it's always been about confession and reconciliation. And for venial sins, there's always been some sort of confession built into the Mass.
Right.
The Lord have mercy, the Confiteor, something. And you would never receive communion without first confessing your sins and saying the Our Father, which is also built in, right? But for mortal sins, it's meant to take some kind of sacramental act that results in your reconciliation. So in other words, you can't just confess to God in your heart. I mean, it's good to do that, but it's not necessarily enough. So
Interesting. So it wasn't just in the early church, it wasn't just the bishop who heard the general confession and then absolved people individually. It was like the priests too. They did give priests that authority. They delegated it
it's
even back then, right?
it seems as though they did. Now, in the documents, in the context of that controversy, it's pretty much assumed that it's the bishop who is doing this, who is doing the reconciling.
Hmm.
But I think, just like what happened earlier with the Eucharist itself, with presiding over the Mass, it becomes a logistical issue. I think that originally these things are the authority of the bishop. They belong to the bishop, but the bishop has the authority to delegate the authority to the priests to do it, when there's too many people for one bishop in a whole city to do this, which is even further evidence for a single bishop in a city, because you start to see this
Hmm.
happening. The priests and baptism as well. Originally it would have been assumed that the bishop baptizes, but eventually there's too many people for the bishop to do all the baptisms. So then we start to see, like in Rome, for example, we have a baptistry built as a standalone building next to the Cathedral of St. John Lateran. And this is built in the 4th century by Constantine. In fact, they built the baptistry before they built the cathedral. But within a century, we start to see smaller baptistries at other churches, because the original assumption was everyone who was getting baptized would come to the cathedral and be baptized by the bishop. But very quickly, there are just too many people to do that. And so then the authority is delegated to the priests at the different churches to do baptisms there, and they start building baptistries. And you see one at Santa Sabina, you see one at Santa Cecilia, and so you start to get these smaller baptistries that archaeologists are finding.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think we take for granted as Catholics and casual observers of the faith as well probably think that when priests confect a sacrament, it's because of some inherent or ontological authority they have, and in a sense, yes, that's true. But ultimately, their their power comes from the bishop,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean,
They're delegates of the bishop ultimately. So it.
yeah, it's almost like the vine and branches thing. I mean,
Mhm.
Jesus said, I'm the vine and you are the branches. You have to remain connected. If you disconnect, then you can't bear fruit. And so, the bishop has to remain connected through apostolic succession. The priests have to remain connected to their bishop, etc. So, um, that authority flows out,
From the
from the
bishop.
vine to the
Yeah.
to all the branches. Yeah.
And of course, it comes from Christ first and foremost.
Right. Right.
It's all a participation. And so, um, today when we look at the relationship between clergy and laity, it's kind of, there's some priests who really get to know their flock, which is great. Sometimes that's not always possible, and there's kind of a disconnect there. How close would like bishops and priests be with their parishes or their people? Like, what was the
Mhm.
relationship like?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that in the early church, all bishops are also pastors. So if you're if you're the bishop of Rome, you have your own congregation too. It's not, bishop back then is not just an administrative position where you're sort of overseeing all these pastors who are doing the actual ministry. So, for example, Clement of Rome, when he was the bishop, probably continued his own parish, his own house church that was meeting underneath where San Clemente is now. Either in the house or the warehouse under there. That was his church, and I probably Santa Maria in Trastevere under there is the house church that Pope Callistus presided over. So the bishops all have a parish or a house church of their own,
Hmm.
and their role is just sort of keep everybody on the same page. And so I think it's hard to say how many people were in a parish, right? So
Hmm.
it's somewhat limited by the size of the space. So in the early church, and again, Rome is the context that I immediately think of first because I know it the best. But in any large city, you probably have some house churches meeting in, beautiful large villas owned by wealthy people. They might even have an auditorium in their home. And I think about the word auditorium, it means the hearing room. And it's
Hmm.
a room that was built into some wealthy homes where they would have poetry readings and little music performances and stuff like that. Well, that auditorium would have been used for the church. In other house churches, though, it might have been, a tiny top floor apartment with a leaky roof where, people are crammed in, leaning up against the walls, and everything in between. And so how many people fit in any, given house church? It depends on the size. It's hard to know how strict they were in terms of, did they believe they had to be at mass every week? Right now we assume they did because that's kind of how we look at it. Those of us who are more traditional Catholics, we have this Sunday obligation, right? You're not supposed to miss mass. In the early church, it might have actually been a little bit more loose, but let's say you weren't at your church for mass one Sunday. Maybe you were out at the catacombs or out at the cemetery, you
Hmm.
know, and maybe you had a mass out there. Maybe a priest came out, or and you had a mass for some, saint's feast day or something like that. And so there's some research that suggests that there's a kind of ebb and flow between the actual house churches and then the cemeteries and
Right.
the
Okay.
the graves.
Yeah.
Now, it's hard to know in the earliest centuries of the church, but that does seem to be the case for sure later when Constantine builds his big basilica churches in Rome. Um, people are kind of going back and forth between those and the cemeteries. So it's interesting, but there's a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a couple things right now. Since we're talking about cemeteries, um, I think you mentioned before uh, there was. I'm thinking of the word refrigerator for some
Yeah,
reason. The
the
refrigerarium.
refrigerarium.
Yeah,
Yes.
tell me about that again. That was so cool. I remember you
I'm
told me
trying to see
about
if
that.
I can I'm trying to see if I can put it in the chat, but it's not letting me write in the chat. Refrigerarium, Refrigerium. Um, it is where we get our English word refrigerator. It means something like refreshment, but in the Roman context, it's a picnic. The refrigerium is a picnic that you have at the grave site of a loved one who's passed on. And the Romans cremated, so sometimes this was just like a mausoleum with an urn wall, a wall with niches in it. But in the Christian context, the Christians continue this tradition, and this is the beginning of the feasts of the saints. So if there
Hmm.
was a martyr, you went out on the anniversary of the martyr's death, and you read the story of the hero's martyrdom and victory over death through martyrdom. You sang songs, you prayed some psalms, and if you had a bishop or a priest come out, you had a mass, and so again, this is happening not only in the churches but in the catacombs, in the graves, or in the cemeteries at the grave sites.
Yeah, that's amazing. So they actually did they have the like did they actually have food and drink at the celebrations too? Did that carry over from Roman tradition as well?
Well, yes and no. So the Romans had food and drink, but they also tried to share it with the dead person. So you have these libation holes where they'd pour wine down. The Christians, I don't think, continued that tradition. I mean, maybe some of them did out of, kind of superstition, but
Right.
and sometimes you will see a libation hole in a Christian tomb, but that's probably because they bought the tomb marker or the tomb cover from a guy who makes tomb covers and just makes them all the same, and they bought a pre-made one. But so for the most part, Christians did not try to put food or drink
Right.
down into the tomb, but they did share it as a kind of a memorial meal. It's a memorial meal. It's like a kind of a picnic thing, and so, I mean, and if you think about it, before the Eucharist gets moved to Sundays, we know it was the agape. It was part of an evening meal in somebody's home. So if you can have the Eucharist as part of a meal in somebody's home, why can't you have it as part of a meal that you share, as a memorial meal at the cemetery? So these things are all connected.
Yeah, and they did have at the picnic they did have the bread of life, the true food, the true drink.
Hmm.
Yeah, and you know what I think too is you know how in every church under every altar there's a relic of a saint. I think that goes back to the grave sites, the catacombs where you had relics of the martyrs. I think that's a direct correlation there. Would you say?
It absolutely is, because what happens is, let's say you're having your refrigerium, and you go out to the catacombs, and either maybe you're celebrating the life of a loved one who passed away, or maybe you're celebrating the feast day of a saint who was martyred. In certain cases, and if the person was wealthy enough, or some wealthy person donated the money, some of these martyrs, and especially if they were a martyr, often the tomb would be embellished with donations, and so you had a larger niche cut out of the catacombs with an actual sarcophagus in it. Sarcophagus is like a marble coffin, and the sarcophagus would be against the back wall of like a little chapel carved out in the catacombs. And I'm sure if you Google this, you can find pictures of these things online. And there's kind of an arch over it, and so it makes this like very interesting sort of shelfy table like thing at the back of the little room in the catacomb with an arch over it, and that became the altar of the Eucharist.
Hmm.
And when a bishop or priest came out to be there for the refrigerium and they had a mass, they served the Eucharist from the lid of the coffin as the table. And
Wow.
so then when Constantine gives money to start building actual basilica churches in Rome, they built them over the tombs of the martyrs. And so the martyr's tomb is either directly under the main altar or it is the main altar.
Yeah, it's still the altar.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and then when they start building the churches inside the city walls, they bring the relics in and put them so the altar table of the Eucharist is has always been, as long as churches were built specifically to be churches, has always been also a tomb with
Huh.
relics in it. And that um, intimate connection between the Eucharist and the resurrection, right, is really borne out in that juxtaposition of tomb and table, right? And so
Hmm.
yeah, so that's always been the case. And so then eventually, when churches were built in other places, the tradition developed that you couldn't consecrate a church unless there were relics in or under the altar. Now, I don't think that's still a rule to this day, but it was for a very long time.
Oh, that's so fascinating. I mean,
Yeah.
so as long as there's been altars, it's been associated with, I, I, not to be morbid, but death,
Well,
and
yeah,
a
but
testament to
but
how
death
death gets transformed, right?
death in the sense that the relics wait for the day of resurrection, right? What
Yeah,
does it say in the book of Revelation? That the saints wait under the
under
altar,
the altar. Yeah, that's so cool. Oh my gosh.
right? And of course,
Yeah,
it's a reference to the heavenly altar,
right.
but also, and you also have to remember the early Christian doctrine of the resurrection is extremely important here. I mean, it's not just the early Christian doctrine. I mean, it is the Christian doctrine of the resurrection. It is the church's teaching. But in the Roman world, you know, your choices for the afterlife were either, Greek afterlife, which is, you continue living in a kind of shadowy existence, but you need people to bring you food, every once in a while, or other like philosophical afterlife, which was some form of reincarnation, or Gnostic afterlife, which is a disembodied existence where your soul becomes one with the cosmos or whatever. But Christian afterlife is radically different from that. And most people, if you ask them what happens after you die, they'll say, well, your soul leaves your body and goes to heaven. Yeah, but that's not the whole story, because the early Christians believed in this intimate and unbreakable connection between the soul and the body, such that even when they are separated, they exist in this tension that waits for the day when they're reunited in the resurrection. So the
Yeah,
relics of a saint under the altar are a witness to this hope of resurrection.
that's so
And
powerful.
not just resurrection in some spiritualized, allegorical sense, but the resurrection of the body.
Yeah. Yeah, when I said death, I should have qualified it more and said like how death is transformed and redeemed. And that's like you said, it's not the end of the
Yeah,
story. And
right.
it goes back to ultimately Christ was laid in a tomb and he resurrected. And so you have the same sort of anticipation placed on, you know, quite literally the tombs of the martyrs, which became the altar of sacrifice in
Yeah.
anticipation of the resurrection. And what does I don't know if it's Saint Irenaeus, he talks about the Eucharist and the resurrection. Specifically, he ties the two together. I
Yeah,
think that was him.
he talks about the way in which the reception of the Eucharist has an effect on our bodies, and I'm not going to try to quote him because I'll get it wrong. But the idea is that just as the divinity of Christ, the divine nature of Christ, by uniting with a body, um, sanctified and glorified that body. In the same way, when we take him into our bodies, he's doing that for our bodies too. And now Irenaeus talks about it in a kind of a past tense as if it's already a done deal, like our bodies are perfected, which of course is a little bit hyperbolic because our bodies are not perfected yet, and
Yeah.
when we die they will decay. But, the anticipation is that in the resurrection, our bodies are perfected, glorified, and to a certain extent transformed for, life in a spiritual realm, such as, I mean, whatever that means, but in the kingdom. But nevertheless, it's still our body. It's still the same body. So we don't get a different body. We don't get a new body. I mean, we get a new body in the way that a caterpillar gets a new body when it becomes a butterfly, right? A caterpillar's body is uh, is suited for life on the ground. A butterfly's body is suited for life in the air, but it's the same individual,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
That went into the cocoon that comes out, and that's a kind of an analogy for the doctrine of the resurrection, I guess.
Well, I'm gonna have to tell that to my kids. Butterfly and caterpillar and resurrection. That's actually really good. I've never heard that before.
Well,
Um,
what's funny about that is the early Christians did not use the butterfly as an analogy for the resurrection because they felt, and this is what I think. It's not like any of them actually said this, but I think they felt that the butterfly was too light and airy and didn't have enough flesh to it to really be a metaphor for the doctrine of the resurrection. The butterfly, for a lot of people in the ancient world, was a metaphor for your soul, and so that's why the early Christians go to the phoenix as a metaphor for the
interesting.
resurrection, because the
Yeah,
phoenix is resurrected from its own ashes with flesh, with its body back, right? So anyway,
interesting.
that's yeah. So the phoenix is kind of a big deal for the early Christians.
Really, I always wondered where the phoenix rising from the ashes is that something like in Greco-Roman folklore, and the Christians kind of, I don't want kind of had that for their own
Yeah,
usage. Is that where that came from?
exactly. I mean, I don't know exactly where it comes from. I there's a part of me that wants to say it's Egyptian, but that's because in one of the versions of the myth, the phoenix lives in Egypt. So it could be that it's really from somewhere
Mm,
else, and Egypt seemed exotic to them, and so they made it live in Egypt. But yeah, it's a pre-Christian myth that the Christians pick up on and use it as kind of an allegory for resurrection. But it's so interesting because when you read the church fathers and they talk about the phoenix, they talk about it like it's a real thing. Like there
yeah.
really is this bird called a phoenix. So they treat it like it's real, and then they say this is a symbol or whatever of
Yeah.
metaphor for the resurrection.
This part of the conversation, just you talk about myth busting, right? So much for the communion of saints being this later invention imposed from the top down onto simple-minded folk. This is grassroots, and this is right from the beginning for all the reasons that you've mentioned.
It is, yeah, yeah. In fact, we have in one of the catacombs in Rome, we have the remains of the picnic ground, like the area
Mm,
where they had the refrigerium, and there are remains going all the way back to the third century of graffiti scratched in the wall, where people wrote Peter and Paul pray for us and stuff like that. So you can see the intercession of the saints is there from the beginning. Well, it's even in the Old Testament. I mean, it's
for
in
sure.
Maccabees, right? Which is one of the reasons why the Protestants later took the books of the Maccabees out of their Old Testament, because there's too much stuff in there that supports Catholic teaching.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as simple as that. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that was the reason, right? Just
Yeah.
historically, not special pleading or being biased, but that just factually was the reason.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, the stated reason is because, these documents weren't written originally in Hebrew. They came
mhm.
later. They were originally written in Greek. And there's some truth to that.
Yeah,
But the point is that Jesus and the apostles were reading those documents. Jesus quotes those documents in the Gospels. And so, that is a part of the early church.
Yeah. Just gonna, do you have, how much more time do you have, brother? I don't want to take it all.
I got all night, man.
You got all night. All right. Well,
Yeah.
let me ask you. So we've covered a lot so far, and you know what I like about this episode is we're really staying true to form when it comes to looking at the church through the eyes of the ordinary people. I really like this.
Yeah.
I haven't seen this really done before. It's usually just like a top-down survey of like this is what the church believed, and based
Hmm.
off of this writer and that writer and this father or that father. But we're kind of really working up from the ground level, which I really like. I think that's refreshing, and not a lot of people would get that vantage point otherwise. That's why I love what you've written so much. It really contributes to that.
Well, thanks. And I mean, full disclosure, like I said, for the most part, lay people don't didn't write things down.
Right.
What we do have, we do have some diaries of laity. We have Perpetua's diary. We have Egeria's pilgrimage itinerary, parts of it. So we do have some stuff written by lay people, and then we have things that are written by lay apologists, who are basically philosophers who, through their exploration of philosophy, found Christianity to be the best philosophy, converted to Christianity, and then taught Christianity as a philosophy. So you think of, here's Justin Martyr. He's a philosopher. He comes to Rome, becomes convinced by Christianity, hangs up a shingle and says, I am now a teacher of the philosophy of Christianity. Now, to be fair, I have to assume that he had the permission from the bishop to do this.
Yeah.
But the point is that, as a scholar, I have to say, look, when you hear some of these early church fathers, and especially the apologists, when you hear them hammering, everyone knows that we all believe X, Y, Z. Well, okay, you got to take that with a grain of salt, because if everyone really believed it, maybe they wouldn't bother to talk about it,
They wouldn't
right?
be writing. Yeah.
And so, it's tricky. And like I always say, you can't proof text the church fathers. You can't say, well, I found one place where somebody says this, so therefore it must have been true everywhere. You have to have read widely enough in the church fathers to know when you see a consensus and when you don't. And so that may be why you don't get this kind of treatment a lot, is because, most of the people who write, a lot of the books that are out there, they're they're armchair theologians or whatever, and they haven't really spent a whole career reading enough from the early church that they can be confident in sorting this stuff out. And I feel blessed and fortunate that I got to do this. And it really is kind of the culmination of everything I was trying to do, because this whole original church thing started because I was taught all these myths when I was growing up as a Protestant, and then when I studied the early church, I realized none of that stuff was true. And there's no such thing as pre-Catholic Christianity, and lo and behold, the early church, the original church, is the Catholic Church. I mean, at least in the sense that the Catholic Church of today is the closest thing that we have, and it's gone through legitimate development, but it's the thing that's most faithful to the church Jesus started, which is
Yeah.
why I had to become Catholic. I couldn't
Right.
not. Yeah,
Exactly. Once you're
yeah,
confronted with a certain amount of evidence, you have a decision to make, and that's not easy
hmm
for a lot of us. Sometimes it
yeah,
costs us our job, our livelihood, but if we want to be serious about following Christ, those are some of the sacrifices that we have to make.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I mean,
so
is the Catholic Church perfect in every way? I mean, do
nope.
our do our leaders always um, uh, give us confidence in them, or say things the way we wish they would? Not always, but I
Yeah,
mean,
we're
at the
Catholic
end of the
because of
day,
Christ,
that's right. We're Catholic
right?
because of Christ, absolutely, and the apostles, and also we're Catholic because of the Petrine office. Like, there's a lot of good stuff in the Orthodox communions, and yet I couldn't be Orthodox because they don't have the Petrine office. They don't have a successor of Peter. And even though not every successor of Peter throughout history has been a holy man, Nevertheless, I couldn't be in a communion that doesn't have the successor of Peter.
And you're just in a like I know everybody's got a bias to some degree. Like nobody's completely detached. So, but with that being said, I've mentioned this to you before, and you've told me, like when you're teaching at a Protestant seminary, like are you trying to bring people into the church? But you told me, look, all I'm doing is I'm giving the record of church history.
Yeah.
That's all I'm doing. And people just so happen to recognize that, hey, that looks like and sounds like church X.
Mm-hmm.
That's just where the chips fall.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's actually it's a really interesting kind of um, safeguard, like because I never claim to be teaching what I believe. Now, most of the time I am, but um, but I'm telling the students, you need to know what your ancestors in the faith believed and how they practiced their faith. What you do with that is up to you. But no one can say anything to me because I'm like I'm just teaching the early church. It's not about me, and so it's kind of my out. It's almost like my I don't know what the right word is. My excuse is not the right word, but I mean that's kind of what I do. And a few people have become Catholic because of my classes, but at the very least, I bust all the myths so no one can no none of my students should ever be able to perpetuate the myths. That the myth that the Protestant Reformation was all about getting back to the early church.
Yeah.
That's not true.
What are some of the other myths that you think are just totally wrongheaded? I mean, when you look at the evidence, what are some things that you can think of that we haven't talked about?
Well, there's so many, but this one, this is I was teaching last weekend, and this came out of my mouth, and I'd never actually articulated it quite this way in the past, but it was only a matter of time. And I said this, I said, preaching was never meant to be evangelism.
Okay, I was just going to ask you too about that. How did the early church think of evangelism? So,
Right.
like, yeah,
Yeah. So,
proceed.
but the Protestant Reformation turned preaching into this sort of rhetoric of conversion, and in doing that, they redefined conversion as a kind of a point in time when an individual makes a logical decision and then later gets baptized as a human rite which commemorates the prior decision they made. So that shift in the definition of conversion has a ripple effect through the sacraments, right?
Yeah.
In the early church and the medieval church, and for most Christians to this day, conversion is not a point in time, it's a process. It's the beginning of your process of sanctification. Baptism is not the commemoration of a decision you made last week or whatever. Now, to be fair, I'm lumping all Protestants together as though they're all sort of, third wave Baptist Protestants, and that's not true. I mean,
Yeah.
there are plenty of Protestants who have something closer to a sacramental view of the sacraments. So we know that. So my comment, preaching was never meant to be evangelism, right? So many people think of preaching as preaching to convert, but in the early and medieval church, preaching was not something that was ever thought to turn someone into a Christian from not being a Christian. Uh, Evangelization in the early church was love your neighbor and be willing to die for your faith. When you do those things, people will convert, right? And that's what
Mhm.
converted the Roman Empire. It wasn't Constantine. It wasn't preaching. Nobody's out on the streets preaching with a Bible in their hand. The Roman Empire was converted by lay people loving one neighbor at a time, even to the risk of their own lives. And then what preaching was always meant to be was, well, Justin Martyr says, when we gather, we read the memoirs of the apostles, which is the New Testament.
Yep.
And then the presider exhorts us to apply these things to our lives. Again, paraphrasing Justin Martyr, but you get the idea. So preaching was always meant to be unpacking the scripture readings and talking about how to apply them to your life. Now, as time goes on, preaching takes on a kind of the role of preaching for repentance. In other words, if you're in sin, repent. You go to confession, right? But that's not the same thing as conversion, as though, it's your first time becoming a Christian. So in the Middle Ages, there's a lot of preaching for, you've been away from the Eucharist too long, come back to the Eucharist, or you're living in this or that sin, or we're going to talk about this saint of the day, and we're going to talk about how to imitate his or her lifestyle. But it's all about, you've heard the expression preaching to the choir.
Right.
And in a lot of contexts, that expression means you're doing something that's kind of pointless, right? Well, I'm preaching to the choir, meaning it means you already know what I'm going to say. I don't even need to say it, right? But actually, Christian preaching was always supposed to be preaching to the choir. I mean, it was preaching to the converted, the already converted, or the preaching to the people who are already Christians, who already buy into the Christian worldview and the authority of the scriptures. Now preaching is supposed to tell them how to apply the scriptures to their lives and encourage them to holy living. That's what preaching was always meant to be. And so, there's a part of me that just smirks every time I see in Protestant context and where I teach, I see these, there's going to be a conference on evangelistic preaching, and we're going to have, we're going to talk about preaching for evangelism. And it's like, okay, but, and I'm not saying we shouldn't reach out to the unchurched,
of course,
try and get them into church, but at the beginning, but really what preaching was always meant to be is explaining the scriptures to the people who just heard them read, who, by the way, don't own their own Bibles and can't read them on their own, and how to apply them to their lives. Man, if I had $1 for every time I've sat in a sermon, and usually I'm thinking partly in my earlier life as a Protestant, but if I had $1 for every time I heard a sermon where they read a scripture passage and then gave us a political speech that had nothing to do with the scripture passage, boy, I could retire on those dollars.
Yeah. Wow. It's so interesting because there was a time when I was Calvinist, and I was constantly introspecting, do I have the fruits of repentance? Because do I have enough fire for the faith? Am I one of the elect? And I was constantly worried about that. And I remember at one point thinking to myself, I'm afraid to street preach. Maybe that means I'm not saved because I'm afraid. So right there, I associated spreading the gospel with going on the street or getting in front of a whatever, or yelling through a megaphone on the street corners. And if I didn't do this, or if I was afraid to do it, that was proof that I wasn't really a Christian. But what you're saying is, for the early church, it wasn't like that. That's a huge deal.
Not at all. There look at, of all the offices in the church and all the ministries, right? There was no office of evangelist in the early church, right? So it just wasn't about that. It was about, well, can you live as a Christian in front of your neighbor so that he eventually wants to be like you? That's what evangelization is. But yeah, I mean, I went through that too. When I was in college, I hung out with the Campus Crusade for Christ folks, and God love them. They were great people, good Christians, but they always wanted me to get out there with the 4 spiritual laws on the campus and just like walk up to people and say, do you know God has a wonderful plan for your life? And that was just not me. I did not want to do that. And it's not that it isn't true. It's true. God has a wonderful plan for your life, but for the most part, um, people, aren't ready to hear that if you just walk up to a stranger. But if you befriend someone and have a relationship with someone, someday they might be ready to hear that. And that's kind of how
Yeah,
it works.
that makes me feel, I don't know, that makes me feel so, in a sense, relieved, because that's been my strategy, and my, I don't want to say strategy as if it's some contrived thing, but just my way of spreading the gospel, my ideal way has been to maintain friendships, genuine friendships, and relationships, loving relationships. And if somebody's not ready to hear the message, my hope is that if I am a good witness through my words and actions, someone will see something in me and say, "Hey, why do you do X?" Or, "What's the deal with this? You go to
Yeah,
this thing called mass.
exactly.
What is that all about?" And then when they're ready and they have questions and they're genuine interest, then I like to lay it all out. So that
Yeah.
makes me feel great that I'm in the company of the early church and I have that same sort of philosophy. Because like I said, I was of the view up until pretty recently that the early church uh, members would have stood on street corners and yelled at people, and
Nah,
that just wasn't
that'd
like
be the
that.
quickest way to get beat up.
And they were prudent, right? They were circumspect. Okay, that wouldn't be a
Yeah.
good thing for us to do, so we're gonna try another way. And on that note, Patrick Bacon in the chat says, "Hey Dustin and Jim, it seems like discipleship is a thing in a lot of non-denominational churches today. How much of this was emphasized in the first century? So this concept of discipleship."
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think it's happening on multiple levels. Jesus said, "Disciple all the nations." I mean, a lot of our English translations say "make disciples," but it's really a verb, disciple the nations. And to a certain extent, I think people would take that as something Jesus said to the apostles. So, you know, the apostles had their disciples who were like their apprentices. You got to think about the culture of the ancient world. It's an apprenticeship culture. You don't go to college to learn a trade or something. You don't go to trade school. You go and live with the person who's doing that trade. And so all the clergy of the early church would be fully invested in this apprenticeship or discipleship model, and that's how they were trained. Now, beyond that, the average member of any congregation is being discipled just by going to mass, hearing the scriptures read, listening to the homilies. That's their discipleship. But certainly over time, certain ones would be raised up out of each congregation to
Mhm.
perhaps be the successor of the priest there or whatever. Um, and so it's going on, but I
They
guess
didn't.
I don't really see the word discipleship necessarily used in the same way that it is. Uh, but but yeah, it's definitely going on.
I mean, I guess the idea is like having discipleship programs, or something, like something formal like this.
Yeah,
That wasn't. I mean, it was a natural. It was a natural thing being part of the community. I mean, you had spiritual fathers, and you were this, and you had spiritual
yeah,
children, and it was just a natural relationship. I think that's just how it manifested itself, and it goes
yeah,
back to, even the rabbis and their disciples. It was a similar thing, and Jesus was called rabbi, and he lived with his disciples, and the disciples lived with him and learned with him,
yeah.
and so it's all connected.
And the churches were small at the beginning, so everybody knew everybody. And that for those who were old enough, there was some form of catechesis before baptism. And then eventually the post-baptismal catechesis, the mystagogia, develops as well, so that the way of early Christian discipleship would have been, before you get baptized for anywhere from 1 to 3 years, you went through a catechesis where you learned how to live as a Christian so that you
Mm,
wouldn't commit mortal sin after your baptism. And then after the baptism, if you might go through a mystagogia where you learned the deeper theology and the meanings of the sacraments. But for those who wanted anything more than that, well, those are the people who became religious. Those are the people who joined
Right.
a monastic order or went out to live with the hermits or whatever. Yeah.
Wow, this is so fascinating. I mean, if my laptop battery lasted all night, I could be here all night. This is fantastic stuff. And we haven't done an episode in a bit. I think the last one we did was about I want to say 3 months ago. It was on St. Peter's tomb.
That's right. That's right.
When
And
we
I know
talked
that
about
because
pilgrimage. Yep.
you know how I know that? Because before this episode, I had to go back and see what I was wearing, so I didn't wear the same shirt.
You do like your floral shirts though. You do.
Well, it's funny in my prayers I have recently been slightly convicted to tone it down. Like
Mm,
I like it's like I'm hearing this voice in my prayers like, what are you trying to prove? Come on. You know, like what kind of statement are you trying to make with the loud shirts? Maybe simplicity of life means, you know, tone that crap down a little bit.
uh, I
I
wonder
don't
if
know.
there's some Clement of Alexandria working on you there. Don't be
Well,
too.
it's actually more the Desert Fathers. I've been reading a lot
Yeah.
of the Philokalia and that stuff, and working on contemplative prayer. And it's amazing how much of contemplative prayer, when you read about contemplative prayer, it's amazing how much of it is about what you're doing when you're not praying, like living a
Mm.
life of virtue and all these things. And there's a real component of simplicity in that. And so any new shirts I buy are going to be more simple and toned down a little bit, and maybe some solid colors. We'll see.
Maybe go all out on a feast day or something.
Yeah, right.
Well, brother, I gotta say this has been awesome. Um, I'm looking forward to when I come down to Florida, we can get together in person again. And I know for sure we're probably going to do another episode on location and be at one of your favorite Italian restaurants. I cannot wait.
we, we will definitely do that.
Definitely excited. And again,
Yeah.
guys, go pick up a copy. The Original Church, What It Meant and Still Means to Be a Christian by Jim Papandrea, and that's Scepter Publishing. So you can get the book off of the publisher's website. I've linked it in the comment, or not the comments, the description. And you can also get it, of course, on Amazon. I think it's still available. I'm not sure what their stock is like, but last I checked, it's there. And I'm lucky because I got my own signed copy. So very blessed to have that. Thank you for that, Jim.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.
Well, you guys have a great night. It is Friday, so we have reason to celebrate. And we still got Saturday and Sunday, the Lord's Day, left to go. You guys have a great night, great weekend, and we will see you soon. God bless.
All right. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Good night.
Good night.